I have to mention that I don't claim to be an expert on Afghanistan or on what happens currently now in the country, but I thought that it's important to discuss the crisis and its various international legal issues. There are indeed a lot of topics which needs international legal analysis, and I hope during the Q&A session we will touch upon most of them or maybe just some of them. But for this presentation, I decided to focus on the history of the conflict in Afghanistan. Like it's very short history, and what awaits victims of heinous human rights violations. But to understand who bears the human rights obligations, it is first important to look at whether the Taliban is a government and what rights and duties it currently possesses. So starting from very nuanced and simplified version of Afghanistan's history related to the current events. So to say the conflict had just 4 phases so far, and the first started with a violent revolution in 1978, in the aftermath of which Soviet troops occupied Afghanistan. And the period of Soviet occupation was accompanied by forced disappearances, mass killings, forced displacement of civilians, as well as opposition figures who were somehow or just supposedly connected to the Islamists. The second phase began in the late 1980s with the formation of the Mujahideen governments, which ended up fighting one another. And during this civil war, another round of serious human rights violations occurred in Afghanistan. The third stage started with the emergence of the Taliban movement, which ended with the Taliban taking control over the country for the period of 6 years, from 5 years, from 1996 to 2001. And during this period, women and minority groups were primary targets of human rights violations. The Taliban reign was over, where after the US troops in the aftermath of 9/11 entered Kabul in November 2001, and already in December this year, the Taliban fled from Kabul and shortly after surrendered its last controlled territories. Hamid Karzai was sworn in as a new leader of the interim government of Afghanistan. So what happened in Afghanistan recently? The Taliban had agreed in a February 2020 deal with the United States to negotiate with the Afghan government over the shape of a power-sharing government and a lasting ceasefire, and of course the withdrawal of foreign forces. It also broadly touched upon the pledges like reducing violence, suspend mass causality, and attacks on cities, and of course the peaceful withdrawal of the US troops. And since then, the Taliban momentum began to build. It took control even of even more rural territory in July, and by the beginning of August, it had begun to target urban areas as well. Then it began an advance on Afghanistan's major cities, and the Taliban captured its first provincial capital on August 6th, and 9 days later, it had control over every major city in the country, including Kabul, and had only met a little resistance from Afghan forces. So the question now is, who is saddled with international legal obligations like the cooperation with other states and international organizations, as well as the respect for human rights? The fled president Ashraf Ghani has not claimed to be still in charge of the country, and it seems that he is accepting the de facto rule of the Taliban. And the US mentioned that the Taliban's legitimacy has to be earned. But the legitimacy of a quasi-government that came to power using force is really hard to earn. And the situation with the Taliban status could be maybe clearer with its recognition by the international community. However, as we know, the absence of official recognition is not a game changer. In Tinoco Consensus Arbitral Award, it was observed that non-recognition cannot outweigh de facto control of most of the territory of a state. And the recent practice of some states also confirms that recognition is not a laudable source for decision-making on whether to enter into diplomatic relations. The UK, for instance, decided in 1980s that, and I quote, there are practical advantages in following the policy of many other countries in not according to recognition to governments. Like them, we shall continue to decide the nature of our dealing with regimes that come to power unconstitutionally in the light of our assessment of whether they are able of themselves to exercise effective control of the territory of the state concerned and seem likely to continue to do so. But the diplomatic recognition has to be separated from the formal recognition of governments, and it remains an option, especially with an option which is often used during the conflict situations, like the one which is like the current crisis in Afghanistan. And entering and maintaining diplomatic relations depend on various factors and policies of different states. But perhaps most important elements are the capacity and willingness of a new government to respect and fulfill international legal obligations, as well as ways of getting to power. There is a little doubt that the Taliban came to power by legitimate and democratic means. And I mean, there is a little doubt that they came to power by illegitimate and undemocratic means. And uncertainty, however, exists with regards to Taliban's willingness to honor international legal obligations. Despite the Taliban's recent pledges to respect human rights and freedoms, the past, however, shows that there is not much hope for this. And yet, only time will show how the Taliban will continue its rule. And perhaps the soonest indicator of Taliban's commitment to its international obligations will be its reaction to the recent United Nations Security Council resolution, which calls for, among others, seeking for a political settlement, including with the participation of women, safe passage out of country, and immediate reaction to terrorist threats. But it seems that already some states have expressed their readiness to collaborate with the Taliban. So that it's the fact that confirms at least the de facto recognition of the Taliban-led government. The US military stated that they plan to cooperate with the Taliban to fight the Islamic State, while Russia and China even leaned forward the official recognition. Another important question is whether the Taliban is saddled with international legal obligations. And the ICJ explained that physical control of a territory and not sovereignty or legitimacy of title is the basis of state liability for acts affecting other states. However, the situation with human rights obligations is not that straightforward. The complete and uncontested international legal personality of de facto regimes is still dependent on recognition by actors who have previously attained the same status and acting as recognized governments in the international arena. Therefore, full compliance with international standards and obligations by the Taliban can be required from them only when they are properly integrated in the international legal order and granted the capacity to participate in international decision-making. Yet, their limited international legal personality still implies that they still have rights like self-defense and duties like respecting fundamental human rights. And in the light of this analysis, I think it's interesting to go back for a minute to the US Taliban deal. And as we already discussed last year when Christiane presented the deal, neither the agreement nor the declaration are necessarily binding as a matter of international law, because it would be difficult to deem the agreement to be concluded between states, as envisioned by Article 2 of the BCLT. However, Common Article 3 to the Geneva Conventions also envisions the possibility of binding agreements between states and non-state actors, and encourages parties to actually conclude agreements concerning IHL with non-state actors. Although Article 3 makes clear that such agreements cannot influence legal personality. However, there are two unanswered questions, at least for me. First, why is the Taliban, not recognized by the US government, was entitled to make decisions with regard to the territory of the state and its population, with the presence back then of the official Afghan authorities? And second, why the US deemed that it has the right to facilitate the arrival of the Taliban to power by implying their functioning authority? So I had difficulties answering these questions from the international legal perspective, so maybe we can touch upon them during the Q&A session. Finally, coming back to human rights obligations, as discussed, the Taliban bears certain international legal obligations, especially obligations of bringing justice to people. And the more complex question, however, arises, which is whether they actually do it. And yeah, this cannot be answered by simple yes or no, because it's impossible to predict the Taliban's behavior. But the accountability puzzle is particularly tangled in Afghanistan, given the multiplicity actors involved in violations of human rights, which were involved in violations of human rights in the course of the last 40 years. And also the fact that the Taliban is one of the perpetrators leaves not much hopes for transparent and just local prosecutions and investigations. So with the scarce hopes for the Taliban's delivery of justice, the international community should do its best to help victims of this awful crisis, but without imposing West ideologies, but instead maybe helping the local initiatives. Although I fully acknowledge that local initiatives might take so much time because of the current chaos in the country. But I want to highlight that I think it's important, especially after the failure of bringing justice to people after the Bonn Agreement in early 2000s, that perpetrators should be brought to account, and therefore an urgent action needed to, at least in relation to evidence gathering. And as we all know, there is an open ICC investigation in Afghanistan, which targets a wide range of actors, of perpetrators, and also there are already a few open universal jurisdiction cases in various European countries, which target Afghan nationals who are accused of war crimes. And there is this investigation in Australia against the Australian troops. And evidence is also gathered by multiple human rights organizations, but yeah, there is still at least no UN mechanism which could do fact-finding. And as a final note, I want to bring your attention to this petition written by several Afghan human rights defenders, including a person I know. And the aim of this petition is to call the UN, OHCHR, European Union, OAS, and African Union to take action and ensure people's safety in Afghanistan. I will share the link to this petition in the chat, but I think it's really important for us and for the Afghans, like what can we do on our individual level? And I think we can, of course, there is not much we can do, but at least on the individual level, we can speak about this as international lawyers, as political scientists. We have to discuss these issues. We have to keep them afloat. We have to spread information. We have to write. We have to give our legal analysis for the future assessments of the future developments in the country. So I guess, yeah, that's how we can maybe make our small contribution to the current conflict. And on this note, I thank you all for your attention. And as I said, I really look forward to your comments, to your questions. Maybe we can discuss other topics with relation to Afghanistan. Yeah, I really look forward to that. Thank you so much.